Good morning and welcome to another session on leadership and management. And today is one of those great days where we're joined by a colleague to talk about her aspect or her perceptions of leadership and one particular aspect of that. So I'm really excited to say good morning, Nia Thomas, and welcome to the Kate, Sally and Michael conversations about leadership and organizations. Would you like to explain to everybody who you are and where you sort of fit into the world of us?
Yes, sure. Good morning, everybody. Nia Thomas, and I guess right now the hat that I'm wearing is that I'm a researcher. So for the last 4 years, I've been researching leader effectiveness, self-awareness and leadership at all levels of the Welsh Public Service. And my thesis is almost complete, so I'm nearly there. But my area of interest really came out of experiences of working in the public sector over the last 20 years and of watching the different behaviours of individuals, particularly individuals at different organisational levels. So some people who have leadership as a part of their role and people who don't have leadership as a part of their role, nevertheless rising up and leading people. And that was really interesting to me. And what I wanted to know was, were people aware of that behaviour? Were they aware of the impact that they had on others? Not aware, or were they aware, don't care? And I wanted to put all of that together and see what came out. So I've been doing a questionnaire and interviews and pulling all of that information together.
Great. Okay, so there's a whole pile of stuff in here, I'm quite sure, about leadership and organizations. Sally, do you want to kick off and start our discussion for us?
Yeah, so Leah, just looking at the abstract with regards to the research that you've undertaken, what really fascinated me was that aspect of leadership or leader effectiveness. So often we see just different descriptions of leadership and what's required in terms of different behaviours in the workplace. And quite often what we see is what makes an effective leader. But actually you looked at it from a different angle. So I'm interested to unpick that a little bit more.
Yeah, the term leader effectiveness, I was quite clear that I wanted to do it that way around, to use that phrase, because in looking at self-awareness, you have to start with self. So it's about leader effectiveness as opposed to leadership or anything else that's greater. So I wanted to start with self and then how self fits into teams, organizations. So yeah, that was important to understand how I fit in the world of leadership and what leadership actually means to me. So leader effectiveness is the term that I've used throughout.
Yeah, and just taking that a step further without this wanting to feel like a Viva interview, I'm interested to explore a little bit more about when you were looking at leader effectiveness, what was the context? So quite often we'll think, well, actually a leader needs to adapt their style and therefore be different in different situations, whether that be different workplaces, different cultures, or indeed, as we've seen in the last year, different circumstances. Did you come up with a single view of leader effectiveness?
So what I did, my whole study is based on self-awareness. So I started by looking at the literature around self-awareness, and I've developed a 3-layer model. So internal self-awareness, internal social self-awareness, and external social. So effectively, we start with self, how self is viewed by others, and then how does my behavior change and how do I respond and how do I behave to change other people's behaviors. So what I did in looking at leader effectiveness, I wanted to understand what effectiveness looked like. And I was able to extract definitions, if you like, from the literature. So I looked at authentic leadership, servant leadership, and resonant leadership, which was particularly important to me. And I was able to draw out 3 definitions that matched next to my definition of self-awareness. So it was awareness of my technical skills and abilities and emotions and behaviours, awareness of impact of those 2 things, and ability to regulate. So actually, when you put them next to the definition of self-awareness, you have 3 layers that build on each other. So it starts with me. It starts with me in connection with others, and then me in response to and in relation to others.
Yeah, so absolutely what you're saying there is you've got a model which would adapt depending on the situation that the leader finds themselves in there.
Yeah, most definitely, that actually whether you're experiencing a crisis or whether you're in good times like we were in the mid-90s, then actually that all of those three levels is about people. And if you're a leader, you're in the business of people and you're in the business of working with people. So actually it doesn't matter what situation you're in, those three layers will fit together and will help you maneuver the difficulties and flexing through, managing through your problem that you have at the time.
And I'm just reflecting on our experiences as executive coaches, which we do quite a lot of. And I'm thinking back with some of the clients that I have at the moment, and arguably most of what we deal with I deal with in coaching situations is helping people have a better understanding of their behaviour, the impact of their behaviour, not just on other people, but on themselves as well. You know, so raising individual self-awareness can be so beneficial for the individual as much as it is, you know, for the organisation.
Yeah. Most definitely. And one thing that I always say is you can't change others, you can only change yourself. And one of the best ways of being able to change others when you can't really is about changing your behaviour towards them, because their response will be different. And if the better you know yourself, the better you're able to regulate your behaviour and the response that you have back.
Yeah.
Interesting that your three layered model of self-awareness, but also three different models of leadership: authentic, servant, and resonant. Did you find any crossovers or any relationship between your three ways of looking at self-awareness and the three models?
Yeah, I think in terms of being able to understand yourself. So in looking at the literature, there were lots of different models of leadership, but actually those three are the ones that became most relevant. So they were talking about the values of leaders in terms of behaviour, the values in terms of how you respond to others and how you behave towards others, particularly around servant leadership. I serve you before I serve myself. So there were commonalities in terms of trust, communication, self-awareness, emotional intelligence, being able to relate to others, being able to build teams. So the commonalities across those were most definitely building my vision of self-awareness.
Right. And Kate, I know values are a particular area of interest for you. So how does what you're hearing resonate with what you've done with values?
Yes, well, I mean, I just love anything that helps us think about how we might develop effective leaders, leaders who are effective. And so I'm thinking about, you know, how do the values that will allow leaders to be effective get developed? Is it something that we're born with? Is it something that we can help people develop? So those are the sorts of questions that always come up when I look at new ways of viewing leadership.
That's certainly something that came out of my research, was that people felt that you have to have an innate ability. So there's a lot of literature that talks about leadership training and, you know, programs for leadership. But through my interviews, people were saying, actually, you have to have an innate ability, and that actually the training can help you enhance and develop. But actually, if you don't have that as an innate value or ability, that actually we cannot teach it. So in the literature, they talk about first order technical skills, and they talk about second order emotions and behaviours. And actually the technical skills are the things that we can teach others. So how do we fix a computer? How do we fix a bicycle? But actually what we can't tell others is how do we show emotion to the mechanic who's hurt their hand whilst fixing that bicycle? So there is thinking that actually how can training develop that leadership ability? And maybe there is merit in actually assessing leadership capability at the very outset of employment or beginning of a course, to understand whether there is something there, an innate ability within that individual to be able to enhance, or are we working with something that does not exist?
So that kind of takes me back to early in my career, when the emphasis really was on getting the right people in the right roles and doing some quite upfront assessment to help people and with their self-awareness to see where they might then head in an organisation, what sorts of roles would be most effective for them. So it was like getting people to be more focused on finding things that fit for them rather than trying to fit people into what the organisation needs.
Most definitely. And one of my recommendations is that we need to consider recruitment, we need to consider internal assessment, internal promotion in terms of how do we raise the importance of second order emotions and behaviours, because technical skills are fairly easy to assess, but the emotions and behaviours are that much more difficult to assess, and we call them soft skills, but actually they're the hardest to acquire.
Yeah. And actually that's I was going to say that's something that we still see an awful lot of, isn't it? Is that people being promoted into leadership positions on the basis of their technical capability. We still see that quite a lot.
Yeah. And Sally, you were saying to me once about some of the clients you have are thinking about how do we create leaders of everyone?
Yes, and I think what's interesting is that I've been reflecting on this and thinking, is it leader effectiveness with a capital L and leader with a little l? Yeah, so there is an organisation I'm working with that is looking at flattening the hierarchical structures, raising levels of individual autonomy and encouraging everyone within the organisation to become a leader. But for them, that's right for the strategic direction they're heading in, for the vision that they have for the organisation, encouraging a more distributed approach to decision making. So is that something that you picked up on, Nia? Is that different types of organisations looking at leader effectiveness differently?
Yeah, and I guess the first thing I'd say to that is that management and leadership, as we know, are different, but actually sometimes you have to look at the management of an organisation in order to be able to allow leadership to raise up. So if we're looking at how do we make leaders of everybody, do we need to assess, as we said earlier, that are there innate leadership abilities and capabilities within individuals? But it does fit well with the notion of complex adaptive systems and complexity leadership, that if we are saying that leaders are everywhere in organisations, we need to give those individuals the opportunity to rise up. We have lots of people in organisations that are introverts like me, and their voices are less heard than the extroverts. And maybe by flattening structures in organisation, that will help people to rise up. It's also worth considering that actually organisation, the leaders within organisation will move depending on what the crisis or the problem or the topic at the time is. So we've seen through COVID that actually the infection control specialists have really risen to the fore, and immunologists are becoming far more revered and important than they previously were. And I think that we can see very clearly that leadership is moving to sit with those individuals. And in 2 or 3 years' time, when we're not talking about COVID, I'm sure that the leadership will flow to different members of people within organisations with different skills.
You see, I wonder if we devalue the word leadership sometimes by using the word leader or leadership in the wrong context. That sometimes some of the things we're talking about, leaders in the organization or everybody being a leader. In essence, I wonder if what we're saying is we just want people to be responsible. We want people to take ownership and be empowered. And that's not leadership. Leadership is a very specific thing. It is not about taking ownership and pride in your work. That's possibly a subset of it. And I do worry about the term team leader. Well, they're not a leader. They're a supervisor in old currency. The overuse of the word has sometimes undervalued the concept. I'm getting a few nods and a few smiles to that. So.
Well, I do think that the language we use is absolutely crucial, because the language we choose to use in organisations sends a signal to people about the behaviours that they want to see more of. So we have moved away, haven't we, from using supervisor, for example.
Yes.
Because of the feeling that can generate in people. So I can understand, I think, why organisations are using leader more fluidly, because, as you said, it perhaps signals the type of behaviour that they want. But I think then when you look at what's interesting about Nia's research, fundamentally, this just comes down to we can all be perhaps more effective in the workplace if we were just more self-aware.
Yes.
So it's often about leaders are the people that are very self-developed.
Interestingly,
personally, and this leadership being a kind of psychological process about the relationships between people, and those that are effective at that are then seen as the leaders.
So if it's there, we can bring it out through our coaching, to our leadership development programs. If it's not there, you can't, there's nothing to bring out. My question, I guess, is it there in everybody, or has it been suppressed in everybody? Is it innate in everybody? I don't know. What did you find in that respect, Nia? Or was that
interestingly? I asked
a different PhD. So
well, I asked the question within my research whether individuals felt that leaders could be found at all levels of organisation, and the answer was yes. And when I looked at the data, it's between around 30% and 60% of people at all of the 5 organisational levels that I identified were saying that actually they could be viewed as effective leaders. So going back to what Sally was saying about organisational leaders, I think we need to work out who those individuals with those innate abilities are through assessment, so that we can give them an opportunity to have a voice. And I think it's okay to say, maybe you aren't a leader, and that's okay too. We are quite fixated on names and job titles, but interestingly, part of complexity leadership and complex adaptive system says that actually it doesn't matter what you're called, because sometimes you can just behave as a leader. And I'm thinking about a couple of individuals that I watched and observed. They didn't have leadership within their job title, they didn't have leadership within their job description, but nevertheless, that individual could lead a team, and they could lead a team to mutiny if they wanted. So I think that the titles we give and actually the functions people have are quite different, but you're quite right that that's the first thing you see on the email signature is what does that person do? And there's an assumption that if they're a leader in their job title, that actually they lead. And sometimes they don't, as you said, Michael, sometimes they just manage.
Yeah.
So just connecting to that then, you said about the ability to be able to test whether people have these innate. Did you come up with any views on what might be the right types of tests? How might they be used?
In looking at potential instruments to use within my questionnaire, lots of tests come through. So there are emotional intelligence tests, there are long ones, there are short ones, there are ones that have been tested, there are ones that are no longer in use because their validity has been questioned. But one thing that I didn't find was one instrument that was focused on self-awareness. So I developed my own questionnaire. And one thing that I'd really be interested in is to see another researcher take that element of my questionnaire and really put it through with the test. So a whole different thesis on a questionnaire itself. But I think there is the potential to change that and to make it into an assessment tool similar to a 360 tool, so that we can look at what do I view of myself and what others views of me. So I think there are lots of tools, but I think we need to make sure that the question we're asking and the tool that's available to us to help us answer that they actually fit together. Because as I may have mentioned, that self-awareness and emotional intelligence are used as proxies. So actually, if you're going to assess emotional intelligence, use an emotional intelligence tool. If you want to assess self-awareness, use a self-awareness tool. So be very clear about the question and the model that you're using in terms of assessing that.
Yeah.
Very true.
I think there's a connection there with what you just said, with what we often see with training requests. You know, when organisations ask us to come in and explore with them or deliver something, you know, we want you to deliver resilience, was a conversation we were having recently. But when you scratch beneath the surface and you have a bigger conversation, you understand actually they need something else. And I think that's where potentially we can be helpful to organisations by actually exploring with them what are the challenges that you're facing at the moment, and therefore what is the right solution for that. So the point that you've highlighted there, I think, is really, really crucial. Be clear what you're measuring.
Yeah. And it will be different in different organisations. There'll be slightly different nuances about what the leader effectiveness is.
Something that I recommended in my thesis was that organisations review from a strategic policy procedure perspective their cultural identity around self-awareness or emotions and behaviours, second order emotions and behaviours. And in doing that, you do need to make sure that it's specific to an organisation. And one of the elements that came out of my research was inclusive decision making. And then actually, if we want to understand what organisational culture needs to be, what the strategy needs to be, how do we then implement that through policies and procedures, it needs to have been developed and defined by an inclusive decision making. So we need to ensure that everybody in the organisation has an opportunity to feed into that, which is why, as Kate said, it might look very different in different organisations.
Yeah. See, this is so interesting to me that you have come at your research from a social constructionist perspective, which is really crucial. It's the conversation that we have all the time, isn't it? That organisations are places of meaning. They're not places of policy. And I think this is the thing that really worries me sometimes, is that the policy is the easy thing to change, isn't it? We're working with organisations at the moment looking at the future of working, home working, for example, agile working, hybrid working. You know, what's the policy for coming back to the office? What's the policy for working at home? And yet actually what really matters is having conversations with people about how do they work best. Yeah. So what is the meaning from the conversation that needs to be had around the construct of an organisation and culture? It's not the policy. And it's that classic between the observable, the policies, the strategies, the training plans, and the unobservable, you know, the conversations that are happening. And if they're not happening, then people are going to feel left behind. So understanding that, as Kate said, leadership is a social and psychological thing. Yeah, so I'm waffling a little bit, but that's the thing worrying me, I think.
But we have, and I'm now running the risk of being critical of the whole HR function. We do have a huge aspect of HR, which is about being policy driven. And the organization development side of HR isn't policy driven. It's about the development of the organization and the culture and the leadership within that organization. I think you raise a huge point that we should come back to about, you know, the role of meaning and the role of policy in our organizations and how they interact. But that's a different conversation for a different day, I suspect. Nia, I'm conscious that we probably should wrap up soon. Your research looks really fascinating. I'm looking forward to talking more about it at another stage. Is there a specific Welsh context to it that you find? Because your research was just in Wales, wasn't it?
It was, definitely. And I think what people are saying to me is that there is a Welshness. And that might be because individuals are living and working within their communities. We have a different language, we have a different legal framework in many aspects of Welsh Public Service life. And it was very clear that actually you can't just tag Wales onto a UK study that's being done. And that was something that was very clearly drawn out within my studies, that Wales is a different situation. We view the world differently on many aspects. So there is a Welshness that needs to be considered. And one of the things that I recommend in my thesis is that this study could be done in different parts of the world. It could be done in different sectors, but you come back to Wales and it's recognised as being different and specific, and it should be called out as being such in any future research.
Okay.
I wonder if that is a Welshness or is that a Welsh Public Sector ish thing?
That's a million-dollar question, I think. What I looked at was the number of individuals who are employed in the Welsh Public Service, and in any given year is about 25% of the Welsh population is employed in the Welsh Public Service, which shows that actually Welsh culture outside of work has a big impact on culture within work and vice versa. So I wonder if you can ever separate that, because I think Welshness runs through both elements.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you, just to sort of finish off, I guess, if you had a message for leaders in organisations from the research that you've done, what would be the area for them to be thinking about and reflecting on?
It would be to say that second order emotions and behaviours are referred to as soft skills, but actually they're the hardest to acquire. And in making organisations fit for the future, you're going to have to start having the conversations about these difficult things, difficult elements. And in order to be able to write policies and procedures that actually make a difference to people, you're going to have these conversations.
Yeah, good point to end.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Hope you've enjoyed the last 25 minutes of us talking about leadership. And Nia, thank you so much for sharing your research with us and getting us into all sorts of interesting avenues that I'm quite sure we'd like to come back to. So thank you very much. We'll see you again very soon. Have a great week.